Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar in partnership with Class and Times Higher Education. My name is Joyce Lau, and I'll be your moderator today. So today we're going to be talking about enabling digital transformations in the Asia Pacific through innovative digital learning tools. I'm so happy to welcome our panel of experts. We're going to talk about some of these challenges. We have Billy Atout, Director of ANZ Class. We have Jerome Lowe, Director of Learning Technologies and Digital Media at Nanyang Technological University, or NTU, in Singapore. And we have Manish Upadhyay, co-founder of Liquid, and an EdTech consultant calling in from India. So we've got people from India, Singapore, Australia. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to start off with Billy's going to just take us through a few slides and a little bit of research that we've been doing research on this topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just get this set up here. I'm really excited to be here today and really really grateful for the opportunity to talk about innovation in this space and how it's really helping APAC and the regions. Here at Class Technologies, we're all about changing the way the world learns through providing the best technology, and really what we do is add some very cool teaching and learning tools to Zoom to help improve student engagement, but also to make it a little bit easier for teachers to orchestrate those online and hybrid classes. But we have done some research. I talk to educators kind of every day in my line of work, and we're hearing common stories across APAC. So COVID came into place. There were some online courses that were available already, but usually it was a small percentage of the entire course offerings. COVID came along and everybody had to pivot very quickly to being able to provide online for everyone for all of their courses. And it was a very reactive approach, right? It was slap a Band-Aid on it and hopefully this pandemic will be over soon and we can get back to normal. As we all know, that pandemic lasted a little bit longer than we all expected, and we're still, feeling the effects of it, even though we are trying to convince ourselves that COVID is over and everything can go back to normal. Life has changed significantly as a result, and particularly in the higher education space. So recently we've done, in our partnership with Times Higher Ed, we have done some research to understand not just the educator's voice, but also the student's voice. And I'm not really surprised at some of the things that we found, but I'm excited to share it with you today. And I think it'll be a good foundation for the rest of our discussion this afternoon. So some of the things that we found out, so post-COVID, we did survey of students across APAC and EMEA to see what their experience was like, but also what is it that they're hoping for in the future. And one of the things that we found was that 68% of students expected some sort of online or hybrid offering from their institutions. And a lot of them were making decisions on where to get their education based on the availability of either online or hybrid. But it's not just about having that flexibility and wanting that. It's also about wanting the quality along lines of those courses. So we found that 66% of the students basically felt that teachers needed some sort of upskilling. So when you go from face-to-face to online, it's not just about the technology, it's also about the instructional design and the ability of facilitators to make that shift, because it's a very different environment. So many students felt that institutions should invest in upskilling their faculty to be able to provide better quality learning online. But the good news is it's not just the teachers, it's also the technology. 85% of the students felt that technology could be improved and more tailored towards online and hybrid learning. So we all kind of shifted to Zoom or Microsoft Teams or WebEx, but those platforms were all really made for managing meetings and not for learning and teaching. And the students could feel that and expect their institutions to make an investment going forward in the technology that's used. When we did speak to instructors, and this was outside of the Times Higher Ed research, this is another piece of research that we did, we found that from the instructor's perspective, the hardest thing for them in terms of delivering online learning was the ability to create that student engagement. So when you're trying to engage with students virtually, it's a lot different from when you're doing it face-to-face. So basically, post-COVID, the expectations for students are to have that flexibility, right? They've been learning for the last 2 years in an online capacity, and they want to continue to have that flexibility. And not just the students, faculty as well. The other thing is they want to be able to access education anywhere. And one thing that we have found as a result of COVID is that the typical geographical borders that prevented students in regional areas or international students from different regions to be able to study really aren't there anymore, because we can deliver education to anyone, anywhere. But I think the area that needs to be really focused on is around quality and creating online and hybrid courses that are on par or have that parity with face-to-face learning. And that's where upskilling our educators, but also improving our technology comes into place. So with class, basically, that's what we've done. We've looked at ways to fill in the gap between what's available for face-to-face versus what is available in virtual classrooms. And we've added a bunch of tools to Zoom to help fill that gap. So we're really excited to kind of explore a little bit more around how innovation and technology can help close some of those gaps, but also cater to what students and instructors are asking now as part of the new COVID normal.
Lily, thank you so much for that great presentation. And we will actually be following up with some more of the research that you've mentioned. So I'm going to just jump into the discussion. So the background that we don't have to go over is that COVID restrictions have led to transformations across the Asia Pacific. However, what we're seeing now is there are very big discrepancies between different countries, different regions, or even different regions within one country. So we're going to talk about adapting the tools that can help institutions expand their teaching, expand their research, and enhance their social impact, and most importantly, to develop their talents. The way this will work is we will talk for about 40 minutes. At the end, we will take questions from the audience. Audience members, on the right-hand bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A. So as we're talking, feel free to start typing in questions, and we will get to them at the end of the session. So the first question I have is, how can online learning enhance cooperation between countries and regions? There's about 50 countries and regions across the Asia Pacific. How can we use technology to eliminate geographical barriers, and maybe, how to achieve a kind of borderless learning? Jerome and Manish, either of you can just jump in and unmute, please. Manish.
Jerome, you want to start?
Yeah, go ahead, Manish.
Okay. No, so I believe, collaboration between countries really means collaboration between learning communities, essentially. And one good example which I have seen and kind of partly experienced, there is a European Commission is doing a lot of work on virtual research environments, VREs as they call it, where researchers work together in real time to solve research problems. and one of the example is it's called VRE, I think VRE4 EIC kind of stuff, where it's a multidisciplinary European Commission research innovation group, and they're using interesting uh, online tools. And I think because the focus of today's session is more on online tools, I thought I will also talk about some of them. So some of the tools which they've been using are collaborative writing tools like Overleaf, Share LaTeX. Google Docs obviously is perpetually the favorite one. Then there are reference management tools like Mendeley. I think all researchers across the globe use that as one of the big tools. Bibsonomy, which is book marking, collaborative book marking tool, very interesting tool again. Collaborative review tools like Academic Karma, PubPeer, annotation tools like PaperHive, and then most importantly, I would say academic social networks like ResearchGate obviously is by far the most popular one. Academic.edu and Loop are other ones that I keep hearing about. And then interesting visualization tools. Now, visualization obviously tools have become very big of late, very recently. So I think one of the approaches is to build these kind of virtual research environments, and I think the job lies with uh, universities such as, I think NTU might be doing it, Jerome can touch upon it, but I think bigger universities, India, IITs and IIMs have those kind of capacity, and there are a lot of groups that have been formed. In fact, so that I think that is one area which I just want to highlight, put on the table, that there is one very concrete mechanism to take this digital transformation forward in APAC region. The other ones are, and I'm taking examples from India, and you guys can take from your respective country. So there is an initiative by Ministry of Education called Virtual Labs, where these are simulation labs and they are free, open. How can we extend that to the entire APAC region? And similarly, countries from other regions can pool in, and we can have a gigantic virtual labs that are available for all people, all students that want to learn, available for free in some form. Especially government universities can do it in a bigger way. In India, they are doing it. There is also, I just researched, and I'm not sure how that group has progressed, but there is a Center for Space Science Education, Technology Education for APAC region being formed, and it is housed in India. And there are now approaches to how to take these initiatives more and more online, and how can virtual access be provided. So I think these are very concrete, I would say, examples which can be taken, and there can be policy groups, discussion groups, and there can be initiative between governments to push online in a real big way. Obviously, coming tomorrow and not now, I think there is metaverse, and I think metaverse is something which is evolving and very interesting, which all of us will look at. Jerome.
Thank you very much, Manisha, from that perspective from India, and some things that, the IITs are doing a lot of very interesting things. Jerome, do you want to talk a little bit about NTU in Singapore and maybe some of the tools that you guys are exploring?
Yeah, before I go into the tools, I'm going to share a story about what happened to NTU. We have something, first of all, COVID forced us to adapt. So it was a forced adaptation. What Billy said earlier was correct. Teams, Zoom was never made for education, but we had to adapt to it. And as a result, education technology became more popular. But now I'm seeing the trend, it's slowly reversing because we're going back to the classroom and so on. So we need to find the right equilibrium. What I mind most is about learning loss. And of course, learning loss is directly proportional to engagement in the classroom. And engagement is not just about the tools or technology. It also stems from the teacher or the instructor, because I've seen a lot of, in my past jobs, I've seen some that are not engaging, and it stems from the instructor alone. So what NTU had gone through, I'm going to make it as short as possible, is that while we're all locked down, there was actually during that period where some of our students couldn't graduate because they couldn't have enough credits. So what we did was, I think we were very blessed to partner with one of the MOOC platforms, Coursera, and we partnered with them, and we curated and identified a certain number of courses that all of our students can take virtually for free, which saved the students $2.5 million in 1 year. And they took the course online on their own, personalized learning, on their own learning path. They choose whatever they want out of those 40 courses or 60 courses, and they got the credits. And as a result, they got to see other content from other universities, which they could have never experienced here in NTU. We're a large university, but that doesn't mean that we can cover every single discipline. So we were very careful to curate those courses that are globally recognized with the similar academic rigor and assessment value or criteria that would align to our academic units for credits. So that gave me an idea, and this is just for thought. Imagine, or I should say, I favor one central or even a neutral higher ed authority establishing a set of general accepted virtual learning standards, for instance, then allowing branching off for experimentation between universities for collaborative developments of content. Okay. Of course, that needs to be guided by those set of principles. And hopefully, with collaborations between universities, there will be new pedagogical tangents that are being born and arising to perhaps more research opportunities and more insights through analytics and so on. Now, from that thought, just imagine if I can create micro learning activities from various global universities and bind them with the ones that I have personally authored in my LMS. So this actually may promote micro learning credentialing. That actually complements my efforts in reaching the student learning outcomes. But more importantly, really for the students, is that they will learn from the creation of content contributed by a fleet of globally recognized university standards, and thereby not being restricted to obtaining education credits from only one university, but rather a collaborative, orderless database that includes learning content, assessments, and activities. Well, as many of us know, and we've been in this industry for a while, our current LMSs can do that. But what I feel is lacking is that virtual learning standards that we can all come together so we could build really engaging content that we can share as a community, as what Manish had said earlier. Imagine that we have a neutral MOOC platform with the APIs and LTI connections that enables content to freely flow between the university's LMS and that MOOC platform where the database is. And it would connect to Blackboard, Canvas, Moodle, Brightspace, and others, similar to what Kaltura, Echo 360, and Panopto has done with their integration with the LMS. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm just wondering, whether I've seen some interest, but it takes a consortium, you see. But diving deep now into specific tools that we use in NTU for engagement and to prevent learning loss and to promote social learning is EduFlow, which I think is a great tool for adaptive branching. It's really nice social media-like type of learning platform. For peer evaluation, we use a platform called Peerceptive. It's just an amazing tool. And of course, we're using our standard LMS, which is really our hub, but we have a layer of other subsystems that interact and actually specifically cater to the specific pedagogies such as team-based learning, such as experiential learning, so on and so forth. So I better stop here. Yeah, I hope that gives you a good idea.
That gives a great idea. And gosh, there was already so much to talk about. It's funny because a few years before COVID, there were all these articles saying the MOOC is dead. People were kind of against MOOCs. And then, of course, as soon as COVID happened, everyone's like, oh, MOOCs. Remember those things that we had dismissed? I actually read a report from ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that was talking a little bit about how materials could be shared. I don't know specifically about MOOCs, but going back to what Manish said, this is something that Europe has also worked on, how to have systems. So it's not an individual MOOC course, and how to work on micro-credentials, because both of you brought up two kind of very practical issues that we face. Some students have not been able to graduate because they don't have the credits. And Manish, I think Jerome, you mentioned the virtual labs. I know that a lot of students who are, say, medical students or science students, they have courses that you can't just Zoom into. They have had their education delayed. So I think this is just really such an urgent situation. My second question is along these lines, which is just how can online learning boost innovation? As Billy said earlier, it's not just delivering a lecture. How can you use tools to encourage or to build innovation? Manish?
Yeah. So the way I look at online learning, and I think one framework which is still very relevant, I think it was there in 1970s and still there, which is Moore's law of transactional distance. And he talks about, for distance learning, learner autonomy, structure, and dialogue are three important pillars, which pretty much defines the transactional distance between learning how teacher delivers and what learner gets. And for example, if you look at a novice learner, the program needs to be more structured. There is intermediate level dialogue, intermediate level learner autonomy. While when you talk about a mature learner, learner autonomy is highest, dialogue is very high, while structure is very less. And it's a combination of who the learner is and how these three things pan out in terms of dialogue, structure, and learner autonomy. And all these tools and innovation that we talk about, I think, can be looked at from this prism, in my view, which is, if you look at learner autonomy, all asynchronous tools, including now Gen Z uses Discord a lot. I saw people doing joint studying using Discord. Students are doing that today's time. So I would put that as a very good learning autonomy tool. And when you talk about structures, all these learning management systems provide a lot of structures, a lot of things that you can do in a structured fashion. And dialogue is where I think companies like Class and Zoom are making a lot of impact, which is these two-way video conferencing platforms with plethora of whiteboarding tools, including you can do whiteboarding in maths, quant, all those kind of subjects also, breakout rooms. So that proportion of dialogue is also increasing. So if I look at dialogue, structure, learner autonomy as a framework and put all the tools in this bracket, look at who the learners are, and then devise my strategy, then I think innovation is going to happen and learning will be real. Otherwise you always look at one kind of a structure, one kind of a dialogue, and one, even in Coursera and edX in today's time, obviously it is varying between how teachers are using it, but largely you find similar kind of course structures and stuff. And the amount of innovation therefore coming out from a learner perspective also is pretty less, because they can't reach mastery if the things are not tuned as per these things. So I just want to put this framework as one of the frameworks for discussion.
Sorry, thank you very much. I think the issue of learner autonomy is so interesting. Jerome, do you want to add a little bit about innovation?
Yeah, I think innovation will always be there as long as we have one focal point, and that is understanding what authentic education is. It really has three parts. That is in learning, applications, and assessments. Now, during the COVID period, we didn't have time. We just wanted to translate and convert whatever that we used to do onto the virtual space. But now people are coming back to classes or in hybrid modes. I really don't want them to forget what all that effort was put in. I think they should think of ways to actually start off with new tangents, understanding how online tools can help with authentic learning. Because with authentic learning and assessments, with real applications such as AR, VR, but that could be quite unsustainably expensive at times, right? Is that we want the engagement to be real. And some tools could be even beyond expectations, such as student response systems, like Turning Point, WooClap, and so on. How often can, in a lecture of 500 to even 1,000 students, where I could poll within 30 seconds the level of understanding of my audience or my students, and actually do response to intervention there and then before going off to the next topic. So you're trying to have no students left behind, rather than to wait for students to wait till midterm for the test to know that actually they've been wrong all along. There are some tools that are actually truly really adaptive for better education, but I think we need to understand the design, more upskilling on both the IT side, infrastructure, learning tech platforms, as well, and more importantly, how the instructors, teachers upskill. It is not about just going to the workshop, knowing how to use a tool. It's about designing. What are the outcomes? Where are your pain points? How can IT or learning tech become your Panadol to alleviate those very abstract topics and get rid of my headaches, to get that 3 or 4% extra time in the class so I could have more engagements. So authenticity, I think, is very important when it comes to learning tech.
Just want to add, Joyce, one more point on innovation. While we are looking at innovation, and Jerome has brought up a very relevant point right from beginning, that learning loss and engagement sits at the center of all learning process. And one of the things that I see most of the higher education institutions struggling that are doing distance learning is videos are not on. And student videos are a challenge, and a class is well received when you see more videos on. Now, what can a teacher or faculty do to make these videos on by students themselves? There are a lot of technologies that support. Zoom does it, classes, a very interesting tool, but in the end it is about, is faculty, again going back, dialect structure, learner autonomy, is faculty creating enough scenarios for dialogue with students within the class itself? And I think innovation in terms of pedagogy is more important than tools, in my view. And I think there should be a big debate on, in this distance learning setting, online setting, what are new pedagogies? There are a lot of theories about pedagogy, andragogy, etc., but we need a distance learning goji. Now it's high time, because these videos need to come on, and that is, according to me, a very, very important pointer towards how engaging the class was.
Thank you very much. I think every professor, every lecturer has faced the Zoom screen where everyone's off, or they're muted, or they have the camera facing somewhere else because they're actually playing a video game. We've all seen that. Well, and this leads us to our next question. The question was, can online and hybrid delivery be made as interactive and as valuable as face-to-face learning? And I think Jerome sort of turned this on its head. maybe some types of online learning can be even more interactive than face-to-face. Because if we've all sat through our freshman class with 500 people and your professor is a dot, or maybe he's on a screen anyway, and how can a professor assess 500 students in person? You can't, right? So can you talk a little bit about how or even whether we can make online hybrid delivery as interactive as sitting in a classroom with your students?
Yep. Shall I? Yeah. Yeah. So, again, I think we touched upon this question in my earlier response, but ultimately, you need to look at distance learning not as is it as effective as face-to-face learning. I think hybrid learning obviously is the way to go, but I think the way to view it is what are the advantages that distance learning per se offers, which a face-to-face learning can't. And I think one of the biggest advantage which I see, which and especially for higher education universities, not for K-12 audience, that should be deployed, is personalized learning pathways for each student, and that you can do in a distance learning setting. The amount of personalization that you can bring in, which looks for, so there was when MOOC came, there was this entire discussion about what are C MOOCs, what are X MOOCs, all those stuff. And I think the time has come where we look at learner autonomy as a biggest driver in higher education, and look at student learning pathways from personalization perspective. What are the tools that can enable them to achieve mastery in their subject, and that also plugs the skill gaps eventually. Otherwise, most of the time it is obviously everyone sits in a credit based structure. There's 30 hours of instruction time followed by test followed by that. So you, even in higher education, we are not striving towards mastery, and because each learner learns differently, and those learning pathways still is a missing link in most of the universities worldwide. And I think distance learning hybrid model can potentially plug that gap. And I think that is something which I want to really highlight, that independent student learning pathways and some flexibility in the way you look at credits, which are not time bound, and which is obviously a difficult thing to say because every year a batch has to go, there is placement and all those cycles. But can somebody disrupt, can some university disrupt that and say there are no artificial dates for moving out? You move out when you are skilled, and everyone has a different pathway to moving out. But I think that is some years to take. But I think there are some policies, like in India, new education policies coming, seems very radical. A lot of new things are being done under that policy. Now students can pursue multiple degrees at the same time. And those are the advantage. When you're doing purely online, you can do 2-3 things together. Somebody who wants to pursue sports acting as a career can also do that parallelly along with a professional degree in the college. So I think those are the things that we need to look at when we look at online learning and face-to-face in continuum.
Thanks very much. It's very interesting. I know India, national education policy came out a year or two ago, and that there are really some big transformations in your country. Jerome, do you want to talk a little bit about this online hybrid versus in-person teaching?
Yeah, I mean, very good points brought up by Manish. But I'm going to focus on certain areas because it's such a big topic, right? Online, I would say online hybrid synchronous learning. So it's in real time. So if that's the case, then I'm going to have students that are in class, and then they're also at distributed locations. So it's distributed learning in that sense. And then the topic will be, I should say, is it a lecture environment or is it a tutorial class, right? Now for tutorial class, I'm going to focus on that because lecture it's a challenge. Hybrid is quite standard. Okay, I'm going to deliver one way. I may pull a student to understand what they understand or not. I may do some intervention, but I will still go through that deck of slides that I need to. But for tutorial, it has to be a little bit more interactive. And how do we keep them engaged and not feel the ones in virtual space left out. I think it has to have a balance of the right tools and also the right learning environment, the classroom. It is no longer where you sit down in rows anymore with a laptop. It should be highly flexible. They could move around. They could use their laptop or using an interactive whiteboard as the projection and complete exercises and do walk galleries where there are cameras recording the whole experience of the lesson. So I think it's a balance of both virtual learning space versus the physical learning space. It's not, and the technologies that encompasses that overall bubble. Because it's a very broad area to go with. And no matter what, I would still say online still has some ways to reach the face-to-face level, at least by perception, the level of engagement, you see. Before, when there was no online learning or very little, there was no comparison. And then when because of COVID, they saw how disengaged they were. They kind of really appreciated face-to-face. But before, they were also saying, oh, face-to-face so boring. My lecture, the person would just talk. I just go in there and do my thing. And then, but they really appreciate face-to-face now. I could see the students coming back and saying, we want that social interaction. But now, if they want that social interaction, if there are distributed learners, how do we not leave them behind? So we have to think about both physical and virtual space together.
In fact, just another point, Joyce, there, just to add, there is this increasing space of mental health balance that has also come to fore post-COVID. And I'm seeing a very interesting model emerging in one of the test prep companies that I advise. Students are opting for offline classes, but 30% of them are still wanting live classes, online live classes as a flexibility. So I think that's where we are moving. We're saying social interaction, like Jerome said, is absolutely crucial for mental health reasons, for etc. So many other reasons. And so is balance of family life. Even a student is a son or daughter to someone, and he has to be at home at times. And this flexibility, if it comes in, it also frees up a lot of mental pressure and stress, which ultimately impacts learning outcome. So I think that's another important aspect which is emergent, which flexibility should be given to students versus face-to-face versus hybrid model, and they should have flexibility, and we can do a balanced structure, 30-40, those kind of stuff as an emergent models.
And that is, I think that's bullseye there. That's what we were struggling for the last 18 months or 24 months or so. And what Billy's presented earlier, 66% needs upskilling, and not only a design, but also understanding how to teach better in the environment. So we came up with a framework in NTU in our team called the Virtual Adaptiveness for Distributed Learning. It's how fast can a teacher or instructor switch from physical to online or hybrid. And that adaptiveness is the flexibility and agility of an instructor. And we need that skill in there in case suddenly half the class is quarantined. How do you react to it fast enough? It's not about technology. Technology is there. It is all there laying for you, but how fast can you adapt to it? So we feel the faculty, teachers, instructors need to be responsible for that skill to be adaptive. Yeah.
I'd like to chime in here. It's very interesting because this is an ongoing debate, particularly with the institutions I work with in Australia and New Zealand. I was just visiting with a customer yesterday and shared some of these stats with them, and they're like, yeah, you said 68% want online or hybrid. We did a survey with our own students, and 70% of them said that they wanted to come back to class. And I said, oh, wow, that's very interesting. But the customer said, but do you know what? Even though when we surveyed them, 70% said they want to come back to class, when we offered them back to class face to face courses, only about 20% of them actually showed up. And you know, I've had other conversations with vice chancellors. For example, the vice chancellor of Swinburne University recently did a speech, and she said students want to come back to campus, but they don't want to come back to campus for the reasons we want them to come back to campus. They don't want to come back to campus to sit in a lecture hall with 300 other students and just sit there and listen. They want to come back because they want that social interaction. And so one of the things that Swinburne is doing is actually completely redesigning their brick and mortar space. They're getting rid of all those lecture halls and recreating kind of like WeWork spaces where students can get together and collaborate and have that social interaction that they're looking for and learn and innovate. And they want that face-to-face to be for that. But when it comes to also having that flexibility for the lectures, yeah, let me do that. Let me do that online. And the other thing I think that's really an advantage of online learning, particularly, is because of the technology that's in place, you can actually measure engagement with certain data points that you can't do in a face-to-face classroom. You can measure how much students are speaking. You can measure how much they're actually focused on the task at hand rather than doing something else. You can measure how many times they're chatting or reacting. So there's a lot of metrics there, not just a sense from the instructor, are my students engaged or not? But there's actually some hard metrics in there that can actually help instructors reflect, right? And understand, what can I do differently? How do I need to change my pedagogy to create a more interactive environment, either online or in hybrid?
Billy, thank you so much. And I think that's fantastic anecdote that, you know, the kids say they want to come back, but then do they actually come back? I want to go back to one of Jerome's points because about the hybrid teaching. We actually had a lot of complaints not complaints, but some comments from professors in Hong Kong who said, if I have a hybrid class, so I've got 20 kids sitting here in my room and I've got X number of kids on Zoom, I can't move from my screen. I can't. And it happens sometimes that the professors would wander off screen because they want to interact. A student has a question, and it's very hard to do. Now our classrooms are being equipped with these kind of like movable cameras, but that's an expensive high-tech solution that, you know, it's very limited to the universities that can afford that. And then back, Billy, to what you were saying, second semester of last year, our lectures were online, but campuses were open. So students were coming in because they wanted to go to the gym and the library and the coffee shop, but then they were going on Zoom to take their class. So I think Jerome and Manish are both right that we're kind of in this like in-between phase right now. It's not like just a Zoom class or just being on campus. Actually, I'm going to pivot a little because we're getting a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone who is writing in. I have a question from Faiz Rahman. Higher education is not just about teaching and learning. Most important is social interaction. How will online teaching affect the future of graduates? I think that's a very relevant point to what we've been talking about. Jerome or Manish, do you want to type in, or Billy?
Just one comment there. So you know, one of the aspect which is again a phenomena which is in works, which is the gig economy phenomena, as well as you know, students, especially in the IT design sector, where online certification holds some value, you know. And I think the more we move towards skill oriented education, where in the end you can prove to the employer that you are skilled, I think degrees are not going to be important. It's some distance away, just to just put a note there, you know. But I think we are moving towards that. We've seen, especially in the IT sector, even in India, hiring where, you know, the employers are putting aside degrees. They just ask a couple of questions and based on skills they hire. So those phenomena have started happening more and more. If we can align towards that aspect where skilling becomes center stage and not exams, and I think that's when ultimately these things will be will pan out and become big. Till then, I think it will be a balance that one needs to adopt, like we've been discussing. It's a 30 40 30 40 40 30 formula that one needs to arrive at, but it is not a mastery driven formula. So I think that's where my issue is, that in higher education the focus has to be towards mastery of skills, but the system doesn't allow all students to achieve that. Jerome, you want to add?
Yeah, very good question. To me, I think going back to what I said in my first note is that authentic learning. If our education and higher learning incorporates a good, healthy level of authenticity in applications and so on, it would actually align with the workforce relevance for when they get into their, when they find a job in the industry and so on. So I think we need to infuse learning activities that attempts to overcome life's grand challenges, to understand all of the content that we learn, using the right technology to understand what are the things that aligns with not only in the future workforce, but also as our responsibility to our environment, to social aspects of the world, so on and so forth. It is tough to do that, especially if I'm doing quantum mechanics. How do I align that, right? There are some limitations, I understand, but we have to start looking that way, or else we just become teaching to the tests and learning to the assessment.
Yeah,
If you look at how jobs are, if you look how job ads are, requirements is Bachelor of Science. And then the other 90% of the requirements are skills that actually is life skills, 21st century skills, which now schools, higher learning is infusing in a curriculum as well.
Yeah, I think institutions and universities' primary goal needs to get students workforce ready. And the workforce has changed as well through COVID. So when we talk about social interactions, back to the question about how can online learning, how does that cater to the need for that social interaction? Most of us for the last 2 years have had to navigate work and team collaboration and teamwork in an online environment. And so a lot of these students, their thoughts, and you'll see some of this as the publication comes out later, but a lot of them feel that the future of their work life is going to be in a very hybrid type of environment. So by enabling them to learn and problem solve and collaborate in a hybrid learning environment is essentially giving them those social skills that they'll need to carry on into a work environment.
Yeah, in fact, NTU is doing that right now. At the height of COVID, we launched something called ICC courses. It stands for Interdisciplinary Collaborative Core. The outcomes actually are the main 3 C's. They are character, competence, and cognitive agility. Every single student at NTU has to take these set of 6 or 7 courses, and they're put into a group for a whole semester, all different disciplines: engineer, design, communications. So they start simulating the differences in understanding of disciplines and how to work and communicate, and not only through face-to-face, but also through virtual classes. So we try our best to prepare them for the workforce, and this is a start in year 1.
That's great.
That's fantastic. And this brings us to the final question I have on my list, which is how can digital transformation help close the skill gap? And I think we're talking about a lot of different gaps. One gap is between the classroom and working, getting a job and doing well in your job. but also the gap between the Asia Pacific, because there are some places like Singapore or Hong Kong that are small and pretty, we have very high digital usage rates. There are other countries like India, which are enormous and highly varied. So there are big gaps between school and work, but there are also big gaps in our region. So can you guys talk a little bit about how digital tools can help close some of these skill gaps?
Yeah, so and now that you mentioned about India, so the way I think first of all, when we talk about digital transformation, the center of it is access to a digital device. And if I look at specifically India, and I think it's true for majority of nation, we divide into following segment: people with multiple devices, segment 1; people with good smartphone and good internet connection; then people with basic smartphone and intermittent internet connection; and then people with non-smartphones. Now, if I look at these kind of device access, which is there in India, you find all these segments. The problem gets multiplied in terms of what you can do in online learning, which will be effective. And when you talk about skill gap, you are taking the nation along. You're not saying it's skill gap only for select few 5-10% students. We're talking about 100% students. So how do you address this device gap? And I think in India, finally we are seeing smartphone becoming very prevalent, and that is becoming center stage for most of the online. In fact, people who have multiple devices also, we've seen 70-80% access happens through smartphone now. So I think that is one thing which I just want to highlight. Second is governments in India have done it, some philanthropic organizations done it. A lot of public education goods have to come out. So one such initiative, for example, in India is a platform called Diksha, which is a platform where teachers are creating online content for teachers. And it is arguably world's biggest now content project. And the beauty of that is obviously the quality of content is always, it's a difficult thing. You can't reach an Oxford quality content. But the fact is now you have local content created by local teachers in local dialect. So no one company in the world can create content at that level of localization because it is not feasible for them. So initiative like this, where public goods can be given to the audience and teachers are creating content in local language, so that the entire student base, and India, you face a severe problem of only 10-20% students understand English, and most of the higher education is done in English. And therefore the skill gap begins from there. They don't teach in mother tongue, they don't understand, and therefore skill gap is there. And then there is obviously a third section. When you say public good, there are marginalized section, people with special problems, etc., that anyways nobody looked at, because from a private organization perspective it is not a base. So I think a lot of thing needs to be done, especially from government universities and government perspective, on these aspects that I spoke about.
I would agree. And I think that while digital transformation can close the skill gaps across different regions, so we basically are erasing borders, and it doesn't matter what country you live in, you can get access potentially to Harvard or to an Australian university or to a Singaporean university without that geographical barrier in place. But it also creates another gap, and that's around digital poverty. And that's a whole nother topic, probably for a whole different webinar. But before, the access to the internet wasn't as much of a factor in terms of how well you could progress in life. But that's changed dramatically, especially in the last 2 years, and it's going to continue to grow. That gap of opportunity is going to continue to grow as a result of some of the digital poverty that exists out there. And it's not a problem easy to solve, but I think governments that are interested and committed to raising up their entire population are already starting to look at how to address digital poverty.
We have a question from Jitanjali. To what extent can universities help students and teachers cope with technological innovation, especially those who are facing difficulty accessing technology. So there really is an access issue. I think it was in India, maybe in Malaysia, where they were actually doing some classes through televisions. Because if you don't have an iPad, you probably have a TV at
Here we
home.
do that. In India, we do that. Yeah. Yeah.
So some high tech and low tech solutions. There are many questions about from the audience about micro-credentials and MOOCs, and having a sort of platform where qualifications are shared. So as we only have 5 minutes left, I don't know if you want to end on this note of talking a little bit. And I know we can do a whole other seminar just on this, about how maybe institutions can share some of these resources, whether they are microcredits or MOOCs or other types of classes. Jerome?
Like I mentioned, it's like you could think of the best house that you want to build, but we need to establish where the land should be, or exactly where it sits on. So that foundation is about the standards, because you have different academic rigor across different IHLs. And these micro so-called learning activities has to align to a broad set of standards before people can come in and subscribe to it. So I think we need an independent body that represents memberships of the IHL to come together and set that. We start small. We could just start at a certain discipline, but understanding where the framework is to be built first. From there, knowing the standards, this is what needs to be done for all of the participating universities. Okay, university A, B, and C may come together separately, guided by those principles, and build a course which they share content. And guess what? It's 1/3 of the effort, but it's exponential in impact to the student.
So Joyce, just quickly, sorry, Jerome, complete your point. Sorry.
Yeah, and the platform has to be neutral enough, and it has to have the right commercialization or some kind of cost recovery that it can sustain. Whether it is existing MOOC platform or not, I'm not sure, but the platform is about technology. There's always going to be technology that does that, right?
So just one point I wanted to mention, Joyce, there is in India again, in new education policy, we've created a system called Academic Bank of Credit. And a lot of universities are joining that bank of credit. And like Jerome was mentioning, so there is actually a movement where bank of credit is now officially launched in India, and where we're saying credit transfer will happen seamlessly within India at least. So that initiative has started in India.
Yeah, for instance, that standard or that guiding light could be, okay, this professor or teacher has these skills. Each of the micro-learning activity has to have, let's just say, a guideline of 20% collaborative exercises, okay? X amount of percentage of this, but plus or minus some leeway. But at the end, it could be audited. And the audited is maintaining that standard. I think that will have institutions come in together and actually be exposed to various types of content pedagogies, rather than one person or one professor only doing it by him or herself. Okay.
Jerome, thank you very much. We have run out of time. I feel like we could talk for hours. I just want to thank our audience. We could not get to all of your questions, and there are so many great questions about online learning and remote learning. And I hope that we can continue this conversation another time. I think the broader theme that we've talked about the whole hour is basically collaboration. There just has to be collaboration between everyone, students, teachers, institutions, different countries. So on that note, I want to thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. And yes, as Billy said, we will have some research coming out about online learning. So thank you very much. And And
Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
very much.
thank you
Thanks, Joyce,
for
for
joining today.
Thank
Have a nice
you.
day. Bye.